Spring 1976, Nice, France. A man walks into the most secure bank on the French Riviera, carrying an alarm clock in his coat pocket. He is not a jeweler. He is not a diplomat. He is a wedding photographer. He rents a safety deposit box, locks the clock inside, and goes home to wait. At midnight, somewhere deep inside that vault, the alarm will go off. The question he needs answered is simple. Will anyone hear it? Midnight passes. No siren, no phone call, no police car outside his apartment. In the dark, Albert Spaggiari smiles for the first time in months. In 60 days, he and 20 other men will tunnel 8 meters through the sewers of Nice, break into that vault, and walk away with $10 million. They will do it without firing a single shot. This is how a portrait photographer beat the best bank engineers in Europe. Albert Spaggiari is 43 years old. He runs a small photography studio a few streets from the bank. Weddings, first communions, family portraits against a backdrop he changes every Monday. He is polite to difficult mothers-in-law. He hands out sweets to children who won't sit still. Almost none of his clients know who he used to be. At 19, he was a paratrooper in France's colonial war in Indochina. He came home with a medal and a habit of saying very little. Afterward, he drifted. Photographer in a small border town, chicken farmer in the hills above Nice. He spent time in prison for a robbery he committed as a young man, and came out sharper, quieter, and far more patient. By 1976, he looks like an unremarkable local businessman. He is not. For over a year, he has been studying one building, the opening hours, the guard shifts, the day the armored truck comes and goes, the angle of every camera in the lobby. He has walked in dozens of times, asked harmless questions at the counter, and left. By spring, he understands that bank better than most people who work inside it. It is the Société Générale on Rue de l'Hôtel des Postes, and it is considered, by everyone in France, impossible to rob. To understand why, you need to understand what was underneath the marble lobby. Behind a single steel door sat the largest private vault in the south of France. 4,000 safety deposit boxes, floor to ceiling, on every wall. Walls of reinforced concrete thicker than a man's arm. A time-locked door that sealed itself every Friday evening and would not open again for anyone until Tuesday morning. Inside those boxes lived the private fortunes of the Riviera. Undeclared cash, gold smuggled out of Algeria, diamonds wrapped in velvet, love letters that could end marriages and careers if they ever surfaced. Even the mayor of Nice reportedly kept a box of his own. The appeal was simple. The bank held no central record of what was inside any box. Lock the door, and your secret belonged only to you. Half the wealth in that room officially did not exist anywhere on paper. The building had been designed around one idea. You cannot rob what you cannot reach. The walls were the defense. The time lock was the defense. Nobody, in the entire history of French banking, had ever gotten through. And because the engineers trusted their walls so completely, they made one decision that would become the most expensive oversight in the bank's history. They never installed a sound alarm inside the vault. Why would they need one? The room was buried under a meter of steel and stone. But Spaggiari wasn't looking at the vault at all. He was looking at the ground underneath it. Weeks before he ever rented that safety deposit box, Spaggiari had been walking the streets of Nice with 19th century sewer maps folded under his arm. Beneath the boulevards and the cafes runs a second city, a maze of stone tunnels, some old enough to date back to Napoleon, some wide enough to stand in, some barely wide enough to crawl through on your stomach. Night after night, he went down there alone, with a flashlight and a compass, mapping the tunnels, counting his steps, triangulating against the streets above, then surfacing before dawn to wash and open his studio by 9. What he found was this: a storm drain 8 meters from the floor of the Société Générale vault. 8 meters of dirt, then concrete, then steel in a straight line. Now he needed a crew, not friends, professionals who could keep their mouths shut underground for 60 consecutive nights. He traveled to Marseille and recruited welders, locksmiths, and a few former soldiers like himself. By late spring, he had assembled a team of 20. The French press would later give them a name, the Sewer Gang. He didn't recruit anyone off the street. He vetted them the way he'd once been vetted in the military, one conversation at a time, watching how a man reacted under pressure before ever mentioning the plan out loud. Welders who wouldn't ask questions, locksmiths who'd already done time and had no interest in going back, men who understood that the job paid nothing up front and everything at the end, in gold and cash, split by hand once the vault was open. He funded the entire operation himself, months of equipment, cable, torches, and food, on the promise of a payout that hadn't happened yet. Every one of them was betting their freedom on a photographer with a compass and a hunch about 8 meters of dirt. In May 1976, the digging began. Every night, once the last cafe in Nice closed its doors, the crew disappeared into the tunnels. They strung electrical cable for lighting, floated tools through the wider sections on rubber rafts, and carried rubble out a few handfuls at a time so the sanitation crews wouldn't notice. Some men stood waist deep in waste for 6 hours straight. One passed out from the fumes and had to be dragged to the surface. Another sliced his hand open on rusted iron and finished his shift anyway, a rag tied around the wound. Spaggiati, the smiling wedding photographer, was down there with them every single night. By the second week of July, after 60 nights of digging, the tunnel was finished. 8 meters of hand-cut earth ending at a thin concrete shell. On the other side sat the floor of the most secure private vault in France. Now he needed one more thing: time. He chose Bastille Day weekend, when the bank would close Friday evening and stay sealed until Tuesday morning. 96 hours of total privacy. On the night of July 16th, 20 men climbed into the storm drain with torches, drills, hydraulic jacks, and enough food and water for 4 days. They reached the underside of the vault and spent the night cutting through, freezing every time a footstep echoed on the street above. In the early hours of Saturday, the last layer of concrete gave way, and Albert Spaggiari became the first uninvited person in history to stand inside that vault. He looked up at 4,000 boxes stacked around him. Then he did something nobody had ever attempted. He turned to the massive steel door the engineers had spent years perfecting and welded it shut from the inside. Now nothing was getting in, and nothing was getting out until they were finished. For 3 days, the vault belonged to them. They set up a folding picnic table in the middle of the room, unpacked bread, cheese, foie gras, and bottles of wine, and dragged in air mattresses to sleep in shifts. Using a custom hydraulic press, they opened box after box. Cash in 5 currencies. Gold bars stamped by foundries that no longer existed. Diamonds folded into black velvet. Bundles of letters tied in ribbon. They took anything liquid and left the documents scattered across the floor. By Sunday afternoon, they had opened 371 boxes. Then a summer storm rolled in over the coast. Below ground, water started rising fast inside the sewers. If the storm drain flooded, their only way out would vanish, and so would the men still working inside. They packed up early. Before leaving, Spaggiari did the last thing he'd been planning for over a year. He handed each man a different colored marker, and 1 letter at a time, in a different handwriting for every character, they painted a single sentence onto the vault wall. Without hatred, without violence, without weapons. In the early hours of Monday morning, the crew vanished back into the sewers, dragging duffel bags of gold and cash behind them, splitting up into different cars, headed to different corners of southern France. 8 hours later, the bank manager arrived for work and placed his hand on the vault door. The time lock had released. The door should have swung open. It didn't move an inch. It took police 6 hours to cut through the welded steel from the outside. What they found became one of the most photographed crime scenes in French history. The picnic table still standing, empty wine bottles, air mattresses against the wall, 371 open boxes, diamonds and letters scattered across the floor, and a sentence painted where everyone could see it. Nobody could explain how the thieves had gotten in, until an officer noticed a small dark hole in the corner of the floor. By evening, the whole south of France was talking about a robbery nobody could quite believe. Newspapers called it the heist of the century. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case. Nightclubs were raided. Known fences were questioned across Western Europe. For 3 months, nothing. Interpol circulated descriptions across the continent. Banknotes from the missing francs were flagged at customs posts from Spain to Switzerland. Every known safehouse between Marseille and the Italian border was quietly watched. The men who'd spent 60 nights underground together kept their word to each other and said nothing, to police, to reporters, to anyone. For a robbery this size, the silence itself became part of the legend. Then, in late October, an ex-girlfriend of one of the crew members walked into a police station in Marseille and gave up a name. Within 2 weeks, that name led investigators straight to Albert Spagiali. He was arrested at Nice airport in early November, and he smiled the entire way. For the cameras, for the magistrates, for the questions. He admitted, calmly and completely, to organizing the heist. And then, he refused to give up a single one of his men. Not under pressure, not under threats, not for a reduced sentence. He fed police a list of false names and stories that led nowhere, and apologized whenever they caught him in a lie. He spent the winter in a Nice prison. On the morning of March 10, 1977, he was brought to the office of the investigating judge for another round of questions. It was a warm spring day, and the window was open. Spagiali answered calmly, the way he'd answered every question for 4 months. Then he handed the judge a hand-drawn diagram of the tunnel, stood up, and said he needed some air. He walked to the window, and he jumped. He landed 2 stories down on the roof of a parked car, rolled off into the street, and climbed onto a motorcycle that had been idling at the curb for over an hour. It was gone before anyone reached the window. He never set foot in France again. Weeks later, the car's owner opened his mailbox and found an anonymous envelope containing a check for the exact cost of the roof damage. No signature, no return address. Spagiali spent the rest of his life in Argentina under a string of false names. A French court sentenced him to life in prison in absentia, a sentence he would never serve. The bank never recovered most of what was taken, close to $30 million in today's money, and many of the wealthiest victims never came forward to claim their losses, because doing so meant explaining what they'd been hiding in that vault in the first place. In 1978, from a hideout somewhere in Latin America, Spagiali published a memoir that became a bestseller in France. 2 films were made about him. In 2018, an aging mobster tried to claim he was the real mastermind behind the heist. A French court banned his book and convicted him of money laundering instead. By then, Spagiali was already gone. On June 10, 1989, in a small town on the French coast, an old woman found her son lying in the courtyard of her home. He was 56. Cancer had finally caught up with him after 12 years spent moving between Buenos Aires, Madrid, and a villa police never managed to find. He never returned a single franc. He never gave up a single name. For 12 years, the walls, the vault, the entire French justice system couldn't touch him. What finally led police to his door wasn't a security camera, a fingerprint, or a broken alibi. It was one of his own men, talking to the wrong person, in bed.